joining the small circle of leaders that inspires thousands of viewers during every...
Welcome. I'm Rob Moyer, and this is What You Need to Know. And today, we're talking about bluefin tuna and the different fish in the sea, commercially valuable ones. And with me is Aditi, and let's go to you. Hello, Aditi.
Hi.
So Aditi is our one of the Ocean River Institute summer interns.
Yes.
Paid position. And not a lot for Aditi's case, but totally good value for it. And
yes,
thank you for
course.
coming today. And so you've been researching the tuna fish situation. So
Yeah.
recently, the National Marine Fisheries came up with new regulations for the catching of bluefin tuna. And so we're going to talk about those changes and what they mean for the survival of the tuna. I was going to start off with talking about, we got different kinds of tuna fish. So the bluefin is the largest of them all, and it's the highest on the trophic level. The bluefin, and the next big one is yellowfin tuna, and then we have smaller tuna, and albacore is now considered a tuna, and skipjack, and so there are various tunas out there, but far and away the largest is the bluefin tuna, and it eats fish that eat fish that eat fish that eat smaller zooplankton or very small fish and zooplankton, and you get down to diatoms, the bottom of the food chain. It's 7 steps up. So if to make a 1 pound of bluefin tuna steak would take about 4 New York City dump trucks of diatoms to be eaten by the tuna to create that much meat on it. So I tend to avoid eating the bluefin tuna because being 7 layers up, trophic ladder, means that any pollutants or heavy metals or anything in the diatoms is magnified into a pound of tuna fish. So tuna and swordfish are the ones likely to have the most toxins in them, so that you should be careful about not eating too much of that if you care. The other tuna, I love having a tuna melt, and I don't have to worry about ever having a bluefin tuna in the tuna melt because it's such an expensive fish, and you're going to tell us why that is. But it generally, the lower down in the food chain, the less expensive the fish is, and the more nutritious it is for you. So basically, look for the least expensive fish, and that'll probably be, it's usually least expensive because that's what the fisherman is catching, and there's an abundance of it. And so that brings the price down. So you can support your local fishermen by looking for the inexpensive fish. And then the fishmonger, the person behind the counter there, can tell you how to prepare the fish. You know, cod is one of our most expensive fishes, and I'll talk more about them later, but the next one is haddock. And haddock is locally caught and sustainably fished. And that's about the same as cod. And then pollock is less than haddock, and hake is less than pollock, and ocean perch, which is Acadian redfish, is less than all of them. And it's just because of the abundance of them. And they're all white, flaky fish. So that's one way to help your local fishermen. So let's talk about the bluefin tuna. And why is this such a commercially important fish?
First of all, you cannot breed it in captivity. So you have to depend on nature for getting the fish. Second is the marbling effect, like equal distribution of fat and the muscles. So it makes it really tasty, and it's one of the most demanded item for sushi. And it's also a supply demand thing. So the supply is limited and the demand is huge. So we know that back in 2017, U.S. fishermen generated a $9.6 million revenue just by harvesting bluefin tuna.
Wow, $9.6 million.
Yes.
And yeah, the tuna is a fast swimming fish, so the muscle is very dark. There's a lot of myoglobin in it. And as you were saying, the finest cuts of tuna are the ones that have the marbled fat
Yes.
in there. We all like eating fat. It makes things taste good, I guess.
Yes.
And in the Japanese fish market, they refer to Boston bluefin.
Oh.
And that's because they think that maybe the cold water off of Boston is responsible for the best marbled meat. But they're looking at the meat, not at where the fish came from when they call it Boston blue. So it's a sign of the marbling and not the geography. But we do see tuna fishermen right off of Boston Harbor.
That's a new fact for me.
Yeah.
So,
So we got two kinds of well, it's mostly hook and line is I think the way that
Yes.
is the way they catch the tuna, and there's been work about so it's all hook and line and
Yes.
that-
mostly hook and line, if cause they are solo fish, they don't migrate in schools. So I would say that trawler catch is not much cost effective for
the
a
smaller
small
tuna
fish.
they can catch with
Yes.
with nets, but the big bluefin tuna,
They're
which is
gone.
like 500-pound fish
Yes.
or something, is only hook and line.
Yes.
So what are the adjustments that they made to the regulations?
Recently, NMFS is adjusting the daily catch limit from one large to medium size, that is approximately 73 inches tuna. So from 3 large to medium size tuna to 1 per day, no matter how many trips you make.
So they used to be catching a permitted 3
Yes.
per day per trip,
Yes.
or per day period, and now they're going down to 1.
Yes.
And they want you. Are they limiting to just catching the large and the giants?
Yes, they have a size cut so
Yes.
that they're making sure you're not catching the smaller ones, and they are trying to allow the smaller fish to grow and reproduce so that it could replenish the natural stock.
Yes, exactly. And so you were saying that the giant ones are about 73 inches long.
Average, they can be larger than that also.
And 73, I got to do the math there because 60 inches is 5 feet.
Yes.
70 is a 6 foot.
Yes.
So that's a 6 foot. Yeah,
Huge.
that's
They're the
big.
size of an average American, I guess.
Yes.
And taller than most of the people from other part of the world.
Oh my gosh. So they're huge.
Yes, they're huge.
And I saw one coming out of the water.
Oh.
And I thought I was watching whales near Stellwagen Bank, and it had enough mass to it that I thought it was going to be a whale, but it cleared the water and there was a tuna fish and stuff, and that was pretty big, maybe 400 or 500 pounds or something. Okay, so what am I asking you now? I'm asking how about the grounds? They changed the number of fish you could take. Did they adjust where they could fish?
Yeah, you can fish anywhere in the world except the Gulf of Mexico, cause is the potential breeding ground for the bluefin tuna, and they're making sure to protect it so that their stock doesn't decrease in the nature, cause as I mentioned earlier, you cannot breed this fish in captivity.
No. And what's remarkable is that the breeding of bluefin in the Gulf of Mexico, some of the bluefins come up here to New England, and some of them go across the Atlantic into the Mediterranean Ocean. So
Yes.
if you catch the bluefin that you're eating in Italy, was born in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's really important that they don't let the fishing happen in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, they are considered as one of the highly migratory fish species in the world, because they literally travel all around the world.
They're such swimming machines.
Yes.
You know, they've got this big, tall tail fin that goes up and down, sickle-shaped fin. And then they got little finlets along the small of their, small of the back, or right above the tail there. And those are because it's a fast-swimming fish. When you have an arrow, you put a little bit of feather on the end of the arrow, and it helps it go straight through the air to your target. And just those little finlets help that fast swimming tuna, go where it's going. Incredible. So what else is the National Marine Fisheries Service doing to maintain a full fishing season?
They have a quota each year that how much tuna you can catch, and they will make a calculation, and according to 2022 report from 23rd June, they are decreasing the number of fish catch per day from 3 to 1, because they have estimated they have already got 7% of the total quota, and there is a whole year that the fishermen need to earn their money and feed their family. So if they reduce the catch limit, maybe the fisherman and the commercial vessel will earn a little less, but they will have their earnings all year round. But if they keep up with the same old number like 3 fish per day, then I think by July or August the quota will be dried out and they will have no income all year round.
Yeah, because they figure out every 3 years, I guess, that's how many fish they can take and still have sustainable fishing.
Yes.
And so they're going to meet that. They're meeting the limit early this summer.
Yes.
So they decided to slow down the catching from 3 to 1 fish, and that way, I see it'll stretch it out.
Yes.
Go around longer and stuff.
So indirectly, they're actually helping the fishermen to live their livelihood.
Yes. Well, the National Marine Fisheries works very closely with the fishermen. It's kind of a government-private entity, and everybody wants sustainable fishing.
Yes.
We want sustainable tuna eating, but we also want to have sustainable fishing so that we can. So what are they doing about how are they increasing the population of the tuna?
First of all, they're prohibiting any kind of illegal catch. So by doing that, what I mean that any commercial vessel or anyone catching the bluefish tunas or the dealers who are buying from the fishermen have to report any discarded living or dead fish within 24 hours of catch. They have a particular website and phone numbers they could dial in, or they could just update their catch. Now this is the first thing they're doing. By this, the NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service could monitor how many fish is getting caught per day and what is the number looking like at the end of the month or end of the year. Second thing is, based on those numbers, they could adjust that either they will increase the daily catch limit, or they will decrease the daily catch limit, or they could even stop the bluefish tuna fishing, because this particular species was at the risk of extinction and around 2017, and then government became really active and they took steps to protect this fish, because we all know, as you mentioned earlier, it's on the top of the food chain, and if it disappears, the system will collapse.
No, we want to have them in the sea.
Yes.
And it's good that they are following up on fish that die on the boats that don't get sold in the market because they weren't including those in their counts, and then they don't realize how much fish mortality there really is. And so that's really good. And then you said they are monitoring both what the fishermen are landing and what the dealers are dealing with or managing. So there's different checks and balances. And then they have the authority, I guess, to just shut it down, say, hey, this is... But the hard thing is counting the fish in the first place.
Yeah.
And so every 3 years they put a real effort out to survey them, and then they try to calculate what's going to happen, but it's really hard to tell the effects.
Yeah, kind of.
Because
you can't count fish in the ocean. So
that's the only place they are, though.
Yes.
So that's the problem.
That's the problem. So you have to depend on the landings particularly. And
right. And then the fishing effort. If they can't find a fish, then you think the population has gone down.
And they made some very clear rule, like it was first misjudged, like you can get 1 fish per trip, but no, they have cleared it. It's like one fish per day, you make 2 trip, you take 100 trip, doesn't matter anymore.
Oh, that's right, because people are putting in 2 trips
Yes.
into one day.
Yes.
You know, if it's catching it off of Situate here, you just
Yes.
zip out there and grab
It's like
one.
a hole in the system,
That's right.
and they have cleared it, and I think it's a huge step.
Patching up the holes in the
Patching up
system
the
so
holes in
nothing
the
falls
systems,
through
yeah.
Well, what else were we going to say about tuna fish? So that's how they're increasing the populations by management, and then you just said this stuff, right?
Yes.
Oh, good. So it's really good. Thank you for telling us more about the bluefin and how that we're managing sustainably.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the issues is that we always hear is the term overfishing. Oh dear.
Yeah.
And overfishing doesn't mean they're actively fishing the fish out of the sea.
Yes.
It means that the population
It's going down.
is not where they want it.
Yes.
So the cod population may not be going down, or an overfished population, the cod probably is going down, but because of global warming, and so we're at the southern extent of the cod population. But people throw that around as like they're overfishing, and it's like, no, it means the population is below where they would like it to be, and so Acacian redfish, which is now sold as ocean perch, was severely overfished during the war. Let me go back to me here. There he is. So the commercial fish, the redfish, the Acacia redfish, was a difficult fish to catch because it was very fragile. It would go to pieces until Clarence Birdseye put refrigeration on the Gloucester fishing boats, and then they could catch the redfish and get it to market and have it and sell it through market. So redfish became the food that fed our troops during World War II, and they just heavily fished the redfish. And so in the early 50s, it crashed, and they closed the fishery. And it took 50 years for that overfished species of fish, the acacia redfish, to get up to a sustainable level. And the reason it took so long was that, unlike a codfish, the acacia redfish, the eggs aren't laid down, they're kept inside the fish, and so the eggs hatch inside the fish. And that means that they have a smaller brood of fish coming out of them than do, a codfish can have like 300,000 baby fish born of 1 year from a single cod, whereas it's a much smaller number with the redfish. And so now redfish is on the market. It's sold as ocean perch, because it's not to be confused with the warm water redfish. It's supposed to be called Acadian redfish, but so we market it as ocean perch, and yet people aren't familiar with it, so they will. When you go to the fish market, the 4 species of fish there are, cod, haddock, swordfish, and tuna. And there's all kinds of other fish that are good to eat. The codfish is an interesting situation. Forgot to turn my timer on. Okay, the codfish is an interesting situation because they were overfished. Too many were taken until they got difficult to find, and this was the first fish that we realized we were overfishing, and we actually passed a law to protect the cod and the striped bass in 1638. So 18 years after the Pilgrims arrived, they noticed that there were fewer cod and striped bass, and they knew that there were no striped bass and cod around Great Britain. So they knew that they could overfish the cod and the striped bass. And so they were worried. And so they passed this law in 1638 that prohibited the putting down of cod and striped bass on your garden as fertilizer. You can't use those fish for fertilizer. You could, because they couldn't overfish them with their hook and lines, I guess, just the pilgrims. There were too few fishermen, I guess. But, and then after that, each generation didn't appreciate the diminution, the lessening of the number of fish, of cod and striped bass. So they didn't pass another law until 1972, when the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Act was passed. And that Stevens was a California surfer who became a senator from Alaska, and he heard about the Russian and foreign fleets working off of the Aleutian Islands, taking vast amounts of fish from American waters. And so he asked to be flown down to see the situation, and the weather was too rough. The pilot wouldn't fly, so Stevens took the airplane himself and flew his congressional team down over the Aleutian Islands to see these Russian ships. And so they said, "Oh, this one isn't good. Let's restrict it to Let's restrict American waters to fishing by American fishing boats." And the problem with that was that the American fishing boats all just filled up and started hoovering up the fish as everyone else did, and the fish continued to go down. But they set up these National Marine Fishery Councils, one for Alaska, one here for the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and this is a combination of a government like the National Marine Fisheries people with the fishing, commercial fishermen and fishing associations, so that they have to argue out, how many fish to take every year. It's a 3-year process, and we got involved with the herring fishery because there were so few. They were taking so much herring that the striped bass were looking emaciated and starved. And so the science of it was to take maximum sustainable yield, to take the maximum amount you could take and still have enough fish, a herring left, or fish, whatever it is, to reproduce. And they forgot that herring in particular are eaten by all kinds of other fish, and so you've got to take a more ecological approach. And so we called upon the the Fishery Council to take an ecological approach, figure it out. How much do you need to leave for the whales and the birds and the striped bass and everything else? And that you shouldn't take, because you don't want to overfish. You don't want to take it so the population goes down. So you have to account for all these different grazers of foragers of herring. And so over the course of 3 years, they they said they were working on it, but they hadn't got it yet. And then at the very end, they go, oops, we didn't get it, forget about it. And so they set it by maximum sustainable yield. They agreed on a maximum sustainable yield number. And that's when the Ocean River Institute, a commercial striped bass fisherman, and a recreational boat operator, together we sued the government for not taking an ecological approach to the catch of herring. And so we went to court and argued that this is what you got to do, and we actually won the court case. So that now they are taking that all into account when they figure out the codfish. Well, especially the forage fish takes, the herring, the menhaden. Those are the two big forage fisheries. Butterfly fish, maybe. So those fish are now, they're taking a more ecological approach. And for the herring fisheries, they've taken it a step further by banning the large herring trawlers from fishing within 12 miles of the coast. There's Atlantic sea herring, and then there are the alewives and the blueback herring that come into our rivers. The alewife obviously comes up the Mystic into the Alewife River. And so the entire population of alewives that have been in the Mystic could be caught by one day, one trawl of the net of these big offshore fishing trawlers for herring, you could eliminate the whole year class with one take. So it's really important that the big boats be further offshore and the smaller fisheries, smaller herring fisheries, be permitted to work the inshore waters. Hopefully the offshore boats are only catching the sea herring, but they tend to mix around, or they have their own kind of, they move around the Gulf of Maine and different stuff. Yeah, they get all mixed up. So obviously the big boats are going for the biggest hauls they can find, and so the bigger schools are hopefully just the sea herring, and they reproduce so rapidly that you can take a lot of herring and still have a sustainable seafood approach on it. But much of the herring is captured for fertilizer and for lobster bait. So they are. There's a company that's coming up with a synthetic or growing lobster bait. You know, the proteinaceous substance that'll be used for, and putting them into kind of like balls or something that the lobsters can go for instead of using a lot of herring, because clearly the more herring you have, the more wildlife it can support, birds, whales, and so forth. So you know, some things we don't know what they're changing, but that's a stress if there's a shortage of herring. And also they've increased dramatically decreased the catching of menhaden. Menhaden's a small oily fish that actually they discovered that they could burn it. The oil was so oily they could use it for fuel. So when the whales got hard to catch, and before they got petroleum going, the scientists said, let's catch the menhaden. And so they got the government to pay them to build these big fishing boats to catch menhaden. It was like the next oil rush, because this was going to be a fuel for putting in lamps and cooking with and stuff. So, you know, the fishermen get blamed for overfishing, but the big fishing trawlers was the menhaden fleet, and Thoreau writes about this, about his walk through Cape Cod, was these enormous, you know, fleets of going after the menhaden. So the menhaden population nearly crashed, and we finally got them to back off about 6 years ago, the catch of menhaden. And they even brought in the factory fertilizer workers to say that, you know, don't remove our employment, but they were going to lay them off next year anyways, because the population had shrunk so much that they couldn't afford to run the factories. So fortunately now we have more menhaden in the sea. And most interesting is the codfish, because in about 400 AD, they learned that the Norwegians and the Scandinavians found that of all the fish, the codfish could be filleted and flaked out and put on wooden stakes and air cured, and the bacteria in the air of Scandinavia would cure the fish. And if you did that to a haddock, it wouldn't cure it. It would just rot. So for some reason, cod you could do this to, and so then they could store the dried cod for 3 years, and so they could, they put it on these wooden stocks, and so that's why we have the expression of, you know, the stock market was the dried fish, the dried codfish that we could that they could exchange, and so there was a stock market, and there was stockpiling, which was storing up your cod, dried cod, and this enabled the Vikings to take their meals with them wherever they went. For 3 years, they could carry a proteinaceous meal with them, and so that enabled them to be able to wander so far afield, because they didn't have to come ashore regularly and go hunting game or trying to catch the fish as they went along. And they did so well, and they were so prosperous that by 912 AD, they felt they had fished out the Baltic Sea, and so they bought Normandy from the Duchess of Normandy and started fishing the North Sea for cod. And then in 1066, they took England to Great Britain in order to access the cod fishery on the outside of Great Britain, out in the Atlantic Ocean, outside of the North Sea. And by 1130, they were catching cod off of Massachusetts. There are records of Scottish fishermen here in the Merrimack River mouth and so forth. So cod is this amazing fish. And then the southern limit of the codfish is Cape Cod, basically. Or the banks off of Cape Cod and George's Banks. Those are the southern limits. And so as the water's warm, we think that we're going to see less cod in those waters. But for some reason, after the overfishing, the cod has not returned to its former place, even though we've backed off all the, we're permitting enough to remain to reproduce, and they're just not. We don't know if it's because other fish have moved into those food niches or those niches in the ecosystem, so that they're not able to increase. Probably, so it's a big mystery. But so like I was saying, that every 3 years, there are two stocks of cod. There's the stock in the Gulf of Maine, and then there's the stock in George's Banks and south of Cape Cod. So the Gulf of Maine stock, they survey by trawling in 7 different places in the Gulf of Maine. And when they did those trawls about, I forget my years now, but they did all these trawls, and they found that there was very few cod, except in one trawl there was a lot of cod, and that was on Stellwagen Bank. And also on Stellwagen Bank and beyond Stellwagen Bank is a closed commercial fishing area for codfish. So they have not been taking cod for 10 years from this big patch that included parts of Stellwagen Bank. And so the thinking was that we've turned the corner on overfishing. By not fishing this area, the codfish has increased its population. And so they increased the catch a little bit. And then 3 years later, they did the 7 toes, and they found no cod on Stellwagen Bank. And so they got, oh my gosh, you've really, busted it and stuff. And so they didn't close the cod fishery, they further reduced it. And people go, well, that's terrible, but the places they had been catching them, they were still catching them. There's this little hole. So if you look at, they did a map of Stellwagen Bank. They, red would be a lot of cod, and blue, light blue would be very few cod. And so for the Stellwagen Bank, there's very few cod. However, there's this one hole, there's one deep spot that is bright red. So if you tone it down, and so they keep saying we can't be fishing for cod on Stellwagen, and yet where the fishermen are going, there's a lot of cod there, and they haven't been able to diminish that supply. So there's a small amount of cod fishing that is still permitted, and but the boats aren't really fitted out for that. So if they do catch it, the quality of the landed cod is not quite as good as the Iceland cod. The cod that we get in the supermarkets mostly from Iceland, and that's being sustainably fished. It turns out that the reason the codfish was high that 1 year on Stellwagen was not because of conservation efforts, but it was because these sand lance are these pencil-thin fish that breed on Stellwagen Bank in the sands, and and we don't know whether they breed every 6 or 7 years or 8 years, because their breeding cycle is longer than a PhD cycle, so no student wants to study the fish. And so the year that there was a lot of cod was because that was a bloomin' sand lance breeding year. And so cod had come from off the bank up onto the bank, as do the whales. It becomes chuckwagon bank with all the feeding of the sand lance when they're in abundance like that. So yeah, so it's very difficult, as Aditi was saying, it's very difficult to count the fish and get a sense. And so we jump to these conclusions when oceans are much more complicated than we thought. Oh my gosh, we got some time to talk about fish. So that's the codfish story. And then, so we have 4 different habitats on the bottom of the Gulf of Maine. So we have the gravelly bottoms, which is where the cod likes to live. And then we have sandy bottoms, which is where the monkfish likes to patrol the bottom. And the monkfish is the ugliest fish in the world. It's got this like bear trap mouth that, so it's kind of flat and rounded, rounded front, and then very small tail. And it opens its mouth like a bear trap. And then it has a spine on its the forwardmost spine has got a little lure on the end of it that it just dangles. And it likes to eat long-tail ducks. And so the ducks will dive for small fish and get eaten by the monkfish. And so they're actually, the longtails have taken to feeding in Nantucket Sound, but then they sleep at night south of Nantucket. And I think it's because they've got, because they're worried that at night the monkfish come up to the surface. And so there may be more monkfish there that makes them behave like that. But monkfish is we learned about monkfish from Julia Child. She brought it from France and showed us how to cook it, because you don't want to look at it. But what the fillets, the fishmongers have fun. They'll put it out at Halloween. They'll put it in their display cases, the monkfish. But it's a great, it's a firmer fish than cod and the other white flaky fish. So it can hold together on a grill, and it's got a little kind of sweet, kind of lobstery flavor to it. Supposedly because they eat lobsters, but I think because just the nature of the meat and stuffing. Because it doesn't taste like greasy ducks, that's for sure. So yeah, that's the monkfish. That's a really cool fish. They used to call it goosefish, and then after the World War II, the Brits started putting it on the menu, and they weren't going to sell it as goosefish. Everyone knew what a goosefish was, and they thought it ate geese, and maybe it does, the small geese. So they changed the name to monkfish, and that's how we know that. So that's the sandy bottom. And then the rocky bottom, the rocky caves and the ledges, this is the world of the wolffish. And the wolffish looks like kind of a cross between a fish and a moray eel. And like the moray eel, it's got these crooked teeth that stick out of its bottom jaw. And it likes to dart out of its cave and grab sea urchins. And there's a video of them that's just crunching the sea urchins and just falling out around their mouth and stuff. And that you can see at the Ocean River Institute, oceanriver.org. And you can learn more about these fish tales that I'm telling you about. So the monkfish is also a good fish to eat. And again, they are quite, we're worried about the monkfish population. Fortunately, they're difficult to catch. You've got you have to hook and line them because you can't trawl a net through the rocks and stuff. But that is a very carefully regulated fisheries. But I highly recommend it if you get a chance to taste it. Okay, so we got the rocky bottom, the sandy bottom, the gravel bottom, and the muddy bottom. And what was the muddy bottom fish? I guess the muddy bottom fish is the Acacian redfish or the ocean perch that I was telling you about, that has recovered and is now being sustainably fished, and is probably the best seafood for the price because it's one of the least expensive. It's not as cheap as mackerel, but mackerel is a dark fish. But I was thrilled to find in grad school that the cost of mackerel is 1/3 of canned mackerel is 1/3 the price of canned tuna fish. So if you're on a budget, you can eat 3 times as much for the same amount. Mackerel, that's so mackerels are fast swimming fish like the tuna. They're like little tiny tunas kind of thing. So we got the 4 fish bottoms. And there are lots of fish in the sea. Then there's the Coryphena. The dolphin fish is a deep water fish that lives in the Sargasso Sea. So it's a long, sleek fish, sort of like a swordfish, but with a blunt head instead of a sword. And it is remarkable that when you catch it, its skin changes different colors of gold and blue and reds and so it's got this ability to change its colors, and it'll go through these colors when it's first, while it's alive, kind of thing. And it is a delicious eating fish, and they lay their eggs in the sargassum seaweed, and so they're dependent on all these sargassum mats, and that grow in the Sargasso Sea. That Columbus encountered them and said, "Oh my gosh, what is this?" But it's just a floating mat of seaweed, and then there are all these animals that have evolved just to live with them. And then we have the Gulf Stream meandering to dissipate energy that it got from squeezing between the Bahamas and Florida. So it meanders, and sometimes the meander will cut off a portion of sargassum seawater, like an oxbow eddy kind of thing. And that will then travel toward North America, toward like Rhode Island. And we call that a warm core eddy. And conversely, you can get a bit of Atlantic Ocean water, colder water, cut off by the Gulf Stream and moving into the Sargasso Sea. So sometimes that's why you can get sargassum weed on the beach in Newport or thereabouts. And occasionally they get the dolphin fish, Coryphena, in these waters. Very rarely though. So that's a fabulous fish. And of course you've got the salmon, and they are, we spent a lot of money on salmon in the Connecticut River to come up to be in the Westfield River. Not a lot, but they're working at it. So we need to, in order for salmon to survive, the waters have to stay cold. And so it's very important that we not deplete the groundwater, because that is what is going into the rivers during the summertime, is cool 40-degree groundwater. And then it's important that the rivers have shade trees on them to keep the water temperature down, to keep enough oxygen in the water to be able to keep the salmon alive. So if we had just, bulldozed it. So we were involved in the Ocean River Institute, testified to the EPA not to build a river water cooled power generator that was going to use wood scraps and stuff. And then we're going to cool it with water from the river. And if you take the water out of the river, then the fish all die, So, and it gets very low in August and September. So that was dodged a bullet. But that would just the need to be cheap, because they can use air cooling. There are other coolants they can use. It just costs more. And so it's important that we have regulators like the EPA that are watching these for to maintain our environments so that they don't get depleted, or to maintain the water in the ground, in this case, or in our rivers, so that the fish can be restored. A lot of work has been done removing dams. The Penobscot River had 2 electric power generators on dams, and they were able to combine those hydro projects onto one dam, and then have really good working fish ladders. I guess they took the other dam down, and then they have a good working fish ladder now. So finally, the Native Americans up in Orono, Passamaquoddy, I'm not sure which one it is there, are able now to get salmon back to their natal shores of where they used to have salmon. So we're getting there with all the different management. So today, America has the best managed fisheries in the world. A couple other countries have some very good ones, but Europeans are way behind on enforcement stuff. Our biggest problem is, so you can be sure that you're eating, even, you know, the cod is not sustainably caught because it's an overfished population, but you're not going to be depleting the cod. You're not going to be threatening, if you can buy it in America, you're not threatening a species. And the way we do that is by prohibiting the importing of illegally caught fish. So that's a huge problem. Well, actually, it isn't. I mean, it's a huge problem. So that all we can do is prevent them from fishing in our waters, and not importing it. And much of the fishing is being done by China because they have a huge market for it. And the problem there is that they will go to the kingdom of a West African nation and tell the king, we'd like to catch your fish, here's $1 million. And suddenly the people on the shores can't find the fish they used to catch because Senegal, I think, was the first place that said, no, we won't take your money. We're going to keep our people eating fish. And then conservation groups have been working with nations so that the Chinese don't do that. However, they're always looking for opportunities. So when the Bahamas got wiped out by the hurricane, America decided not to send aid. So the Chinese came in and built the tent city for them and brought their fishing fleet in and scooped up all the fish around the Bahamas. You know, pretty good deal there. So it's a real issue. It's a real difficult issue is to manage those. And one way, I guess the only way you can really do it in international waters like that, where no one has authority, is to set up marine protected areas where there's a peace accord to where there's where I guess the UN or a group of nations can enforce no fishing. And it's much easier these days because every fishing boat has a beeper on it. So you can tell, I can go online and with my cell phone see all the boats that are off of Cape Cod, off of Boston Harbor, for example. And then you can tell if a trawler's going trawling speed, then you think it's fishing. And if it's just transiting to somewhere else, it's going much faster. So we've got a lot of good intel. And we've been putting monitors on the fishing boats because a big problem is bycatch. So if you're going to use a net, a purse seine, or trawling with a large net with otter doors, keeping it open, you're going to catch all kinds of stuff. And so they're very careful in regulating the size of the mesh so that only the right kind of fish gets caught in there, but all the bigger stuff gets caught. And so that's considered bycatch because they haul the whole stuff up and then they dump everything but what they can market back into the ocean, and most of it dies. And so that's why they've been talking about dolphin-safe tuna, means that they used to chase the smaller tuna, the albacore, the skipjack, they would look for the dolphins, and the tuna tended to swim behind the dolphins. And so they would set around the dolphins to catch the tuna. And then they'd have all these dolphins who didn't know to jump out of the net, and they'd get entangled in the net. And so there are all these fatalities of dolphins. So they've had to change their practices and not set on dolphins. And hook and line is the only way that you can be sure you're not getting dolphins. And so those tuna cost a little more than the set ones. So the market is making the fishermen work a little harder because we are saying we want dolphin-safe tuna and boycott these other places that aren't selling dolphins. So that wasn't government regulation; it was the market that got got them away from netting, trawling, skipjack and albacore, and instead hook and lining them so they wouldn't kill the dolphins. And this is why that the recent Supreme Court ruling prohibiting the EPA from regulating and like with a stick punishing coal burning utilities and people that are like West Virginia is exceeding they're out of compliance with the amount of coal they're burning and fossil fuels they're burning. So they sued, and it took 7 years for the Supreme Court to decide that it's unconstitutional to regulate like that. But the thing is that regulations haven't really been working for the last few decades. In 2020, they found out that what was it? Well, they found out that the SUV cars were all rolling over with something as simple as a flat tire was causing the SUVs to roll over. And so Congress passed a rule saying you have to say the likelihood of your car, your brand, rolling over, of your SUV. And at the time there were 14 models, and all but one of them had a 30% or greater chance of rolling over in an accident. And 4 years later, only one roly-poly SUV was left on the market, and the other 13 had solved the problem. And that wasn't by government regulation, that was market regulation, that people were not going to buy it that way. And so we've had a number of situations, and this is what happened with the tuna fish too, the canned tuna, dolphin safe. So by taking away the EPA's ability to regulate, it's not really slowing down the process of addressing climate change, because it's finding solutions like the regional greenhouse gas initiatives has got the Northeast states coordinating on reducing their carbon burning, their fossil fuel use, except for natural gas, or shifting to natural gas away from the other fossil fuels. And if they're not in compliance, they have to give money to the states. And so in June, $260 million was collected from utilities for, and that is much better than having to fine them for doing something. So we're in pretty good shape for that. Having the Supreme Court decision sounds terrible, and it would have been terrible 30 years ago, or it's 50 years it's been operating. But now we're moved on. And the whole Paris Accord, Glasgow COP26, all of those are non-regulatory. They're completely voluntary. Yes, when the state ratifies it, then that may have some regulations in it. But you first have to figure out the way forward and not just punitively punishing people with fines. Okay, so we have really talked about tuna fish.
Yes.
And all the fish. And the final thing is we are working on, sometime this month, Beacon Hill, we want them to declare a North Atlantic Right Whale Day. So the one day a year we'll be celebrating the North Atlantic right whale. And this came about because the Delaney family, Matt and Ramona Delaney, they lost their grandmother in April, and a couple days after the funeral, they were down on Provincetown, driving along the beach, and they were worried about where their grandmother was and missing her. And this right whale just rose right near the beach, and came out of the water and breached, I guess. And it was just a spectacular show of right whale that reassured them that their mom was okay. And so for like 10 years, they've been calling April 24th as Right Whale Day. And it's interesting that April 15th used to be the day that you could set your calendar by when the right whales returned to Provincetown, was April 15th. So that's my kind of right whale day. But the Delaney's went to Josh Cutler, their state representative, and he has put together this right whale bill. So we are collecting signatures and asking people to write a comment about why they'd like to have this right whale day. And for a small donation of, I guess we're saying $10, we have right whale stickers with a mother and calf. We have them 6 inches and 2 inches, and so those you can have one of each for a contribution. So all of that is at www.oceanriver.org. We'll be passing out those stickers at the Boston Green Fest and whenever we're tabling in different towns. But yeah, so please check out www.oceanriver.org, and you'll see 6 campaigns there. And one of them is the North Atlantic Right Whale Day. So please click on that and send us a little comment about why right whales are important to you. Oh, there's also a bill that you can comment on that's in Washington to have the right whales, or the government's going to give money to the fishermen to buy the equipment that gives the breakaway gear to them. So if you, the Right Whale Rescue Act, if you want to support that and comment, again, www.oceanriver.org. So that's all the time we have today. So I want to thank you for tuning in, and please, take some time to take some care of yourself. Oh, I gotta thank Aditi. Thank you for coming here and stuff. And
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And all of you, thanks for listening. And be sure to take care of yourself and then try to take some care of this planet of ours.